So this week's message is for the single guys. We're going to hear from some single ladies and what they're looking for in a future husband. And so to rewind, last week we talked about love does not envy. This week is love does not boast, found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And Paul says that love does not boast because he's talking about what happened in chapter 12, where the church was boasting about who has better spiritual gifts, like, oh, I'm a teacher, I do administration. And Paul's like, hey, stop it. This humility is important. And so we're going to hear from two single ladies, Ainsley and McKenna, and hear about why they think humility is important. And so guys, listen, because here's some free tips for you.
I think God has demonstrated humility by sending his son down for us in baby form, not necessarily as a king who is prominent over others. He came down just as we are, and he met us where we're at.
Wow, that's a big question. So for me, what I think of is the fact that Jesus, or God, in his love for us, came down on earth as a baby, a completely helpless baby. He's the God of the universe, and he just came down as a baby, meaning that he was completely dependent on someone else. He had to have his diapers changed. He had to be fed. He had to learn how to talk. All these things, it can be kind of embarrassing or weird to some people, and it's like God was humble enough to come down in human form, and he grew up and he lived as we lived, and he lived a sinless life, but then he was a man and he faced temptations just like everyone. And then he went and demonstrated perfect love by dying on the cross for all of us. And that was a horrible, horrible, humiliating death, a criminal's death. He lived a spotless life. And so it was completely humble and pure love, which he showed us by dying on the cross for everyone to see.
I think that if we're humble as Christ followers, then we're portraying to others that we're not better than anyone else. We're just the same. There's nothing holy about us. We're just human like everybody else.
One of my favorite Bible verses, it comes from John 15, and it says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." That's Jesus. Those are Jesus' words, and he's calling us to, as he says in a different chapter of the Bible, to pick up our crosses and follow him. And that's a very humbling statement. That's basically saying, humble yourself as I humbled myself. Nothing else should matter. You should just pick up your cross, whatever it is, and follow me. So if Jesus commanded that, then it's pretty important.
A humble believer that has been an influence in my life is definitely McKaylee. When her and Grant went down to Australia for 6 months, it just showed that they're willing to sacrifice so much for God. And even when they came back from Australia, they weren't up on stage like talking about their trip. They just came back and submerged themselves with everybody else. And I just think that's super humble of them not to advertise what they were doing. They just did it out of the kindness of their hearts. I think that a man should be humble because it shows that they're willing to put others before themselves, especially God. And to be a Christ follower, you need to sacrifice what you're comfortable with. It shows that they love themselves enough not to be boastful or full of pride. Rather, they put others before themselves. It also shows that they're willing to seek God's help rather than relying on their own strength or wisdom.
Humility is a really big deal because for me personally, I want someone who's going to chase after God's heart, someone who strives to live like Jesus lived day by day. I'm not saying he'll be perfect at all, but he strives for that. He strives to be humble. Jesus was humble in everything he did. He was sacrificial. He constantly was giving of himself for others. And that is one of the most important qualities, because if your world is completely centered around yourself, then that's going to be a disastrous relationship. Like, there's no happy end in sight for that, because it's pretty hard to truly love others if the only person you love is yourself, and if you're so self-focused, that's the only thing that will really matter to you in the end. And I want someone who is going to put God first and foremost, me and his entire family above himself.